Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to have to call for order. The crowd is so excited. You're very welcome to this afternoon's event, the Archive of the Future, celebrating the launch of our project Beyond 2022. We had an exciting launch this morning at 11 a.m. When the Dean of Research from Trinity and John McDonough, who's still with us, Director of the National Archives of Ireland, spoke. And we were very excited by the support we got from that. People at that launch, I know many of you weren't with us this morning, but were told both to turn off their phones and to tweet, which was a technical and scientific challenge which they overcame. Because apparently we trended and we reached number 4 in Ireland with hashtag Beyond 2022, so that was very exciting. So please keep on tweeting, but maybe with the sound off your phone. I think that's the solution. It's a great pleasure to have worked with my colleague Shay Lawless, the co-PI on Beyond 22, bringing this event together, and in particular welcoming the directors of the 3 archival partners and Natalie Harrower, the director of the Digital Repository of Ireland. I won't do any more introductions than that. My job is to hand over to the Vice Provost of Trinity College Dublin, who's very kindly agreed to welcome you all, Professor Chris Morash. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much, Peter. When you're doing things like welcoming people to an event, there's certain things you really shouldn't do beforehand. One of them is go off and read some Jacques Derrida, so that's precisely what I did. I went back and reread Derrida's essay from 1995, Archive Fever, and it started me thinking again about archives. Archive. Derrida starts with the word archive. So familiar a word, he says. And he reminds us of what the Greek root of the word is, arche, which he says names at once a commencement and a commandment. The word itself, this Greek root, means quite literally the place from which we begin. But by extension, it also means a kind of first principle, the point from which authority or power derives. It's the same root that we find in words like archetype, archangel. There, says Derrida, where authority, social order is exercised, in this place from which the order is given. So a point of commencement is a good place to start. It reminds us of a number of things. First of all, that an archive is a place, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But it's a starting place, not least for research. I think probably all of us in this room have had that experience of being in the archive, and something we've been maybe puzzling over for years in some cases suddenly comes into focus. And that moment in the archive becomes quite literally our starting point, the point from which the answer begins. The relationship between the archive and power, however, I think is the more interesting one in this case. The arche, the first principle, the point from which authority proceeds. Now, Derrida, when he's writing about the Freud archive in Vienna, the idea, and he's working through the idea that here, the place where he's standing, is where the authority through which we shape our understanding of consciousness, our understanding of understanding, if you like, begins. But in the case of the Irish archives, this idea that the archive is the site of an origin of authority has a different significance. That image of the flames pouring out of the forecourts while the archives go up in smoke is, I suggest, an archetypical image. Notice how I got that word archetypical in there. An archetypical image of the origins of the Irish state. It's the image that tells us that the Irish state is one that has, at the moment of its commencement, a flaming absence. It's the site of authority, where the site of authority should lie. There's only ashes. And I think this helps to explain a lot about Irish public life since and now. The fluidity around the name of the state as to what constitutes the national territory. Our fixation on the 1916 proclamation as a kind of surrogate founding document. Our endless fascination with questions of constitutional law. The burning archive is, I think it could be argued, the Irish state's absent origin. And that's what makes so exciting what we're celebrating here today, or commemorating, or commencing with the Beyond 22 project, 2022. It's particularly exciting for me personally, because before I took up my current role here as Vice Provost, Chief Academic Officer, I still am, the Seamus Feeney Professor of Irish Writing, and I was a member of the Making Ireland research team. So I was in the room when Peter Crooks came up with this crazy idea that you could somehow reconstruct the archive digitally. And he since picked this up with Shay Lawless and developed this idea of this reconstruction of the lost archive. I think it takes real vision to come up with the idea that you could reconstruct the archive using basically 3D virtual reality of a destroyed building, bring the shelves back together, put together those lost records from digital copies. And I think it showed a grasp of the symbolic force of the archive, to imagine that that project could be completed by 2022, the end of our decade of centenaries, a kind of capstone to that project. Add to that the close association of the National Archives in the UK, the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, our own archives here, National Archives here, the Irish Manuscript Commission, and doing this in the context of Brexit, I think adds an additional resonance to what we're doing. I just want to go back to Derrida for a moment before I finish up, and his etymology of the word archive, where he reminds us that it's the place from which we begin. When those public records burnt in 1922, it was the place that burned. But in that century, the concept of place has been transformed profoundly. When Derrida is writing that essay in 1995, he comments almost off the cuff that he says psychoanalysis would not have been what it was if email had existed. And that was 1995. I don't know about you, but I remember first time I really remember using email in any kind of serious way was about 1992, the early 90s anyway. So, I mean, he's writing just as email is starting to become part of our consciousness. And I think in those 20-odd years since, what place means has changed profoundly. That what we are creating, or what's being proposed here in this archive of the future, is an archive that forces us to think what reconstituted place means, what it means to put place back together. And it's for this reason that people like Francis Blowen, for instance, writing in 2004, would now tell us that the archive itself is an intellectual problem, a cultural artifact worthy of study. And I think this project not only brings together records in a way that will enable specific research in specific areas, that the project itself poses an intellectual problem that is worthy of study in its own right. So for all those reasons, it's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you here to this event that's going on today. It will be remiss of me not to acknowledge the support of the Irish Research Council, the ADAPT Centre, and of course the Making Ireland research team. I'd particularly like to welcome our guests here, Jeff James, Michael Willis, John McDonough, John McCafferty, Natalie Harrower, Professor Lorna Hughes, University of Glasgow, who's going to chair the Beyond 2022 Advisory Board, and of course, to congratulate Peter and Shay for the legwork that has gone into this and making this event happen. And of course, to welcome all of you. It's great to see a full room for an event like this, and congratulate all of you for showing up for something that is helping us to reimagine our concept of a point of origin for the archive of the future. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasant task to hand you over to our librarian, Helen Shenton, who's going to moderate the rest of the afternoon's proceedings. Helen.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. So, in fact, I'm librarian and college archivist, and your words were making me think. It's always struck me that there's a very interesting relationship between archives and power, and particularly totalitarian states are particularly good at archiving. So I'm just thinking aloud here, is if you think about the Stasi, and then, do you know Timothy Garton-Ash's book, The File? So he's an historian and a journalist, and there was a file kept on him by the Stasi, and he then went and confronted every single person who had written about him, his neighbours and everything like that. And the other one is that absolutely still chills me. I have nightmares about it. I visited Tol Sleng, which is the school it's an innocent school in Phnom Penh, which is where Cambodians were taken for torture before they went to the killing fields. And there is this chilling, staggering archive of every single person was photographed. And there is, I don't know, if there's something about totalitarian states and archives, and that just came to mind. On that note, Jeff, so Jeff and I worked together. We just worked out, it was for 2 years, we overlapped at the British Library. I'm going to invite Jeff as the Chief Executive and Keeper of the National Archives to speak first. We'll go straight on to Michael Wills, who's Director. I'm very interested in these different titles, actually. So, Director and Keeper of the Records at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And then straight on to Natalie. Natalie Harrower, Director of the Digital Repository of Ireland. And then I will moderate our discussion. So, Jeff, please.
I was thinking there I might have to redo my speech. So it's very nice to be here. Anybody who's here this morning will testify to some of the great speeches we had this morning, including some comments from my colleague John, who reflected on the fact that you couldn't have planned for the events of 1922. It did make me think that I wonder in an alternative universe, if those events hadn't happened, that we might still be here today talking about the conservation challenges of this magnificent building, which is probably not the best design for an archive, if we're being honest about it. So it is great to be here. It's a bit of a bittersweet moment, I suppose, because in a way we'd rather we weren't, but this is a fantastic project, and I've been delighted to have been invited to mark the launch of Beyond 2020. Beyond, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? I'm going to try and say that today. It is a hugely exciting and ambitious project, and we're very thrilled to be one of the partners on it. As Helen said, I'm Jeff James. I'm Chief Executive and Keeper of the National Archives. We're the official archive for the UK government and for England and Wales. And we're one of the biggest archives in the world. We have over 11 million physical records on 200 linear kilometres of shelving, which means a lot to me as an archivist, but probably not an awful lot outside of the room, although John and I were reflecting that we do talk about the size of our collections in different ways. We've also got about 40 kilometres in a salt mine in Cheshire, which is one of the curiosities of Kew, and our collections stretch back about 1,000 years. But we're also a digital archive, and digital technologies are opening up our archives like never before, increasing the discoverability not just of digital records, but of paper records at the local, national, and international level. If you take, for example, our online catalogue, Discovery, it holds 34 million descriptions of records, not just at Kew, but in archives across the country. Archives Inspire, our 4-year strategy, explicitly identifies digital as our single biggest challenge, while articulating our ambitions to become a digital archive by instinct and design. Implicitly, it recognises that we can't achieve this in isolation. And this underlying thread that ties archives together is the thread of collaboration. To paraphrase Darwin, in the long history of humankind, those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. And what really stands out for me in Beyond 2022 is the nature and scale of the collaboration involved. And we're very proud to be one of the partners in this incredibly innovative project. It's a perfect illustration of the kind of innovation and collaboration that we're seeing across the sector, and that briefly is something that I want to talk about today. So I am going to touch on digital, but really I guess the thread, as I say, is collaboration. In March 2017, the UK government launched a new co-created vision for archives. Archives Unlocked is about digital transformation and collaboration. Public expectations around access to archival collections are changing rapidly, and successful archives are those which are adapting. More and more, we talk about the porous nature of archives and the wider ecology within which they not only survive, but continually thrive. Archives like the Hive in Worcester, which not only houses the County Archive, but was the UK's first fully integrated public and university library, and a groundbreaking partnership between Worcestershire County Council and the University of Worcester. It's also breaking ground in finding new commercial income opportunities in the face of challenging financial pressures, whether it's Explore the Past website marketed at the overseas family history market. Archives Plus is in the heart of the City of Manchester and at the heart of the regional's cultural offer. It's a partnership between Manchester City Council, Manchester University, the BFI, and several community organisations. Archives Plus is engaging with communities in innovative and exciting ways, attracting new audiences and enhancing confidence and pride within the communities that they serve. The Keep in West Sussex brings together in one place record collections spanning 900 years of the region's history, including the special collections of the University of Sussex and the Mass Observation Archive. The Keep opens its doors and collections to schools, colleges and universities, and like the Hive, it's exploiting commercial income streams, leasing classrooms and lecture spaces and helping to ensure its long-term sustainability. But we're seeing this kind of partnership working at the national level too. Last week, I had the privilege of awarding the 100th Archive Service accreditation to the National Theatre, coincidentally the very first theatre archive to be accredited. And later this year, we celebrate the 5th birthday of Archive Service accreditation. Fundamental to its success is the partnership behind it. We're proud to be one of 7 partners, including the Archives and Records Association, the Archives and Records Council Wales, National Records of Scotland, Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, the Scottish Council on Archives and the Welsh Government. ARA, and I see John's in the audience today, ARA is a very natural partner for us. There are clear advantages for the sector leadership body and the professional body to come together for the benefit of our shared sector. But we're also increasingly realising the benefits of partnership outside of the archive sector. Some of you may also be aware of our successful partnership with Research Libraries UK, of which Trinity College Library is a member. Libraries and archives share many of the same challenges and opportunities around funding, around resilience, meeting changing public demand, changing expectations around access, and of course, digital. Together, we, TNA and RL UK, run the highly regarded Discovering Collections, Discovering Communities Conference, an annual platform for people across the libraries, archives, museums and research sectors to share ideas, develop research opportunities and forge new partnerships across different disciplines. Another product of our collaboration with RL UK is our joint research, including recently commissioned work on citation capture, which is helping us to understand how researchers use archival collections, with the aim of promoting greater collaboration between researchers in the future. Finally, I'd like to touch on our developing partnership with JISC, a membership organisation connecting students, researchers and academics across libraries, archives, colleges and universities. Among other things, JISC runs the Archives Hub, which includes descriptions from over 300 UK institutions. With over 34 million records on our own Discovery catalogue, over a third of which come from the wider sector, there are obvious opportunities for us to open up access to UK archival collections by working together rather than working in competition. And these partnerships allow us to pool resources, share expertise and work together to enable the very best possible outcomes for archives, for their collections, for them, and for the people who are using them. So I've talked about collaboration at the local, regional and national levels, but the challenges and opportunities we face as a sector are global in nature, especially the digital challenges. Our digital director describes digital preservation as an international team sport. The move to digital is a paradigm shift that will require novel approaches that cannot be delivered by any one organisation. Last year, we published our first international strategy, Archives Inspire the World. We want to promote the value of archival collections around the world, to develop knowledge networks, support standard setting, and pioneer digital preservation solutions. and we're beginning to see the benefits. Prize papers are a collection of global importance, letters, diaries, poems and artifacts, many of them unopened, captured from ships seized by the Royal Navy from the 17th to the 19th century. Making the collection available to all is a huge and ambitious piece of work, only achievable through partnerships. That's why we've partnered with the University of Oldenburg on a 20-year research project to catalogue, transcribe and digitise this amazingly rich and unexplored collection. The Arabian Gulf Digital Archive project is a collaboration with the National Archives of the UAE to digitise and place online 500,000 records of interest not only to the Gulf region, but also to academics and researchers around the world. And finally, I mentioned earlier our collaboration with JISC and Archives Hub. At the European level, we've joined Archives Portal Europe, exposing discovery data to one of the largest international aggregators of archival catalogues and collections, nearly 6,000 institutions across 32 countries. So just to wrap up, there is a paradigm shift in what it means to be an archive, driven by new digital technologies and shaped by a perfect storm of changing public expectations around access and transparency, the need for resilience and sustainability in a changing financial climate, and the pressures imposed upon archive services by the various public inquiries. In many respects, the archive of the future is already here. This is an exciting and challenging time to be an archive, a watershed moment, and collaboration is the key. I'm therefore delighted that the National Archives is a partner in this really exciting and pioneering project. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Chris and Helen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd firstly like to thank Peter Shea and their teams for the invitation to speak today. As Helen said, my name is Michael Willis and I'm the Director of the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, or PRONI, as it's more usually called. Helen suggested I was the keeper of the records of Northern Ireland, but fortunately or unfortunately, I'm the deputy keeper of the records. The keeper of the records is typically our minister, and we don't have a minister at the moment. Today's forum is entitled The Archive of the Future. Looking to the future, there are undoubtedly many challenges and opportunities for the archival sector. I was thinking of these, and these include things like budgetary constraints, fulfilling statutory obligations, enhancing digital capacity, collaborations and partnerships, the increased use of these, developing and retaining our staff, providing leadership and advocacy, being visible, accessible and relevant, delivering a quality service, and there are obviously more. We face these challenges in the context of the impact of ongoing austerity and have to compete with other sectors for scarce resources, both within and outside government. You'll be glad to know, I am sure, that I don't intend to address all of these challenges today. I'd like to focus briefly on 3 areas. In the context of this Beyond 2022 project, I think it's appropriate to say something about the origins of PRONI and the journey it has been on as an archive and record office since its establishment in 1923. Secondly, I intend to look at how PRONI has used collaborations and partnerships as a way to widen access to PRONI's archives and records, increase our public visibility and awareness, and to reach out to new audiences. And finally, time permitting, I will also say something about the importance of leadership and advocacy, something which is critical not only for the development of current archives, but for future archives also. PRONI is located within the public sector in Northern Ireland. It is part of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and is currently part of a group called the Engaged Communities Group, which is one of 4 groups within the Department for Communities, DFC for shorthand. DFC is one of the 9 government departments in Northern Ireland. There was a reshuffle of departments a number of years ago. We went from 12 to 9, and we're still getting to grips with that. So that's PRONI in 2018. I'd like to go back almost 100 years, which is appropriate in the context of this launch event. The loss of the official Irish Archive and Record Office, the Public Record Office of Ireland, in the fire at the Four Courts in Dublin in 1922 sets the scene. The Northern Ireland government was aware of the need to fill the gap created by the disastrous fire in Dublin, and the Stormont Parliament established the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland under the Public Records Act, Northern Ireland 1923. This act sets out PRONI's statutory obligations of receiving, preserving, and making publicly accessible archives and records. These statutory obligations are as relevant today as they were in 1923. These obligations still shape the work of PRONI and its strategic vision as an archive and record office. Interestingly, John McDonough mentioned similar obligations for the National Archives in Dublin when he spoke this morning, and I'm sure it's the same for Jeff and TNA and for other archives. PRONI opened in March 1924 in the fourth floor of a former linen warehouse in central Belfast, a place called Murray Street. And although PRONI was the official repository in Northern Ireland for all public records, it also had the remit to take in private records. I understand from some amateur historical research that this was carefully crafted into the act by D.A. Chart, who was the first deputy keeper of the records, but more of him later on. PRONI initially focused on bringing in private archives that would plug some of the gaps in the archival record created by the Four Courts fire. And this is explicitly referenced in papers that we have in PRONI from the time which I was discussing this morning with Shay, Peter, and with Kieran. Bringing in the private records meant going to solicitors' firms, businesses and organisations, private individuals and families to persuade and influence them to deposit their archives with PRONI. The search extended beyond the boundaries of the new state. I discovered that the first private documents that PRONI received were 2 estate maps of Cookstown, County Tyrone, given by a Dublin firm of solicitors. Should have given them to you, John, but they didn't. Acquiring private records to this day remains important for PRONI, but of course this has to be balanced in terms of scarce resources and other competing archival priorities. I mentioned earlier the importance of strategic leadership, and so it's appropriate to refer to the important work of Dr. David Chart, PRONI's first deputy keeper of the records. Chart had worked in the Public Record Office of Ireland. He knew well what had been lost in the 22 fire. It was through him that all of the people I spoke about, the solicitors, the business people, the politicians and the landed aristocracy were persuaded to deposit their archives and records, which were a significant substitution for some of the losses in the Four Courts fire. And again, we have archives and records that explicitly reference that fact about bringing material in to replace what had been lost in the fire. Chart's leadership and vision was instrumental in setting PRONI's direction and arguably still influences PRONI today. Chart's work was carried on by the 8 deputy keepers who followed him, and the 8th that was following him. The strategic leadership in particular of previous deputy keepers, Heatley, Darwin, Traynor, Malcolmson, Slater and McClintock cannot be underestimated. A quote from a deputy keeper's report from 1960-1965 about D.A. Chart says, quote, "Many will be indebted to him in the future, but will probably never realise to whom they owe a debt." And I think we are looking to the future here, but it's important to realise the work of colleagues in the past. It still shape what we do. One of the implications of PRONI's archival acquisition campaign was that PRONI needed more storage space. Since I've come to PRONI, I think that many archivists here present will perhaps think that nothing has changed then, because storage space seems to be an issue. PRONI moved in April 33 to a central Belfast location, the first floor of the Royal Courts of Justice in central Belfast in Chichester Street. PRONI's expanding archives meant yet more space was required, and in 1972, PRONI moved to Balmoral in South Belfast. And in 2011, we moved to our purpose-built state-of-the-art archive and record office in Belfast Titanic Quarter, which is close to East Belfast. PRONI now has increased storage, modern exhibition spaces, education facilities, and improved public access, as well as improved staff facilities. I don't think I can outdo Jeff's statistics, but this near century of acquisition has resulted in PRONI holding 54 kilometres of shelf-filled records and archives covering every aspect of life in Northern Ireland and other parts of Ireland and beyond. A veritable treasury of information about our past, protected for our future, which is perhaps summed up well by PRONI's vision, which is about protecting and providing archives for all. And you can see the link there to the legislation I mentioned earlier. I want to now move to talk a little bit about collaboration and partnership as a way to widen archival access and outreach. PRONI has increasingly used collaborations and partnerships as a way of widening our access to archives, increasing our visibility and reaching out to new audiences. Collaboration and partnership is central to how PRONI delivers its services, and particularly how we reach out to those audiences who might not be aware of the historical, social and contemporary relevance of archives. I will briefly mention centenaries, libraries, local government and official inquiries as positive and important examples of the collaborative and partnership approach that shapes the way PRONI works. In terms of centenaries, as this launch is about the upcoming 2022 centenary, it's appropriate to highlight PRONI's partnership approach to this. PRONI works with a number of partners, sharing resources and providing access to our archives and records to mark the many centenaries and anniversaries that span the 1912 to 23 period. PRONI will celebrate its market centenary in 1923, so Stephen Scarf, my colleague, is in the audience. We're going to have to get working on that, Stephen. Our centenary partners include the Community Relations Council and Heritage Lottery Fund, who coordinate a decade of centenaries round table. Other centenary partners include the National Museums of Northern Ireland, who are to be found within the Department for Communities as an arm's length body, Creative Learning Centres, the Imperial War Museum and the Northern Ireland War Memorial. This launch today is an excellent example of positive centenary partnership and collaboration in practice. And it was mentioned this morning by John, the Beyond 22 project is the first formal collaboration involving TNA, PRONI and the National Archives here in Dublin. Hopefully there will be much more such archival collaboration and partnership working to come. And I just would like to pay tribute here to Stephen Scarf, Head of PRONI's Public Services, who's here today and has been critical to the success of PRONI's centenary partnerships. So no pressure on you, Stephen, for the future. Libraries NI is the public body responsible for Northern Ireland's 96 libraries. During 2017, PRONI has cemented our close ties with libraries NI by signing a memorandum of understanding, setting out how we will work together, including collaborative projects and hosting travelling exhibitions. Our first joint project was the launch of an exhibition marking the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in November 2017, called From the Medieval to the Modern, Reformation, Transformation and Continuity. The exhibition was launched in PRONI and is now touring the 96 libraries across the north. This was an exhibition we could not have done in isolation, as Libraries NI contributed material from their fine books collection in Belfast Central Library, which was complemented by PRONI's original archival sources. Travelling exhibitions are an excellent example of outreach and action, particularly in a jurisdiction where there is often a geographic perception that the focus is normally on activities in Belfast. I'm not sure if colleagues find the same where they are located. PRONI has 5 other travelling exhibitions currently touring the LNI network, and that long may this continue. Northern libraries are widely regarded as important local community hubs, and our travelling exhibitions are an excellent means of effectively reaching out to communities throughout the north that we usually struggle to reach. The partnership with Libraries NI is one which we at PRONI intend to develop and expand. Another excellent example of practical collaboration and archival outreach, this time is working with local government in Northern Ireland, is PRONI's contribution to the new permanent exhibition on the history of Belfast, located in Belfast City Hall. PRONI provided copies of major data sets relating to the Ulster Covenant and Belfast Street directories. These have been reworked by the City Hall into touchscreen interactive applications that can be enjoyed by audiences who would not normally engage with archives. They also include signposts to PRONI's website where visitors can explore the many online resources that PRONI provides. My understanding is that well over 20% of the City Hall exhibition draws on PRONI archives and records. The exhibition is free. I have visited myself and I found it to be excellent and a really enjoyable exhibition, so I would encourage you to visit it if you get the opportunity. PRONI will, of course, be keen to work with other local government partners where the opportunity arises. Finally, and Jeff alluded to this in his talk, there are many examples where the records that PRONI holds have a direct contemporary social relevance, and that the demand for access and use of these records is likely to increase in the future. The Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry is a good example. This inquiry examined whether there were systemic failings by state institutions in their duties towards children in their care in Northern Ireland between 1922 and 1995. The inquiry worked with the archivists in PRONI from the outset. The inquiry researchers were embedded in PRONI so that they could identify and access relevant archives. This is an approach that I've discussed with some colleagues here about 2022, perhaps going forward. Although nearly 360,000 pages were included in the evidence bundles, of which a large proportion was derived from the records and archives held by PRONI, Sir Anthony Hart, who was chair of the inquiry, published his report in January 2017 and paid tribute to the important work of the archivists in PRONI as the custodian of a wide range of records which the inquiry's researchers accessed. PRONI's records were critical and fundamental to the work of this inquiry, yet more positive evidence of the continuing social relevance of the current and the future archive. Jeff again alluded to the demand for access to archives and records will continue to grow, which poses many challenges, not least in terms of technological and resource issues. It would be remiss of me not to mention the importance that social media such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube will increasingly have as a way of allowing effective engagement with archives and outreach to existing and new archival audiences. Engaging with our stakeholders through social media takes us into a very fast and content-driven environment where we need to provide content quickly and at great frequency. This, of course, again, is both an opportunity and a challenge, as we have found in PRONI recently. It was only in the last summer in 2017, after much lobbying and persuasion, that PRONI received, quote, permission to have its own Facebook page, this is the way sometimes things happen in the civil service. But working within existing resources, the impact of Facebook has been positive and immediate, and Facebook has become an important window on the world for PRONI, allowing us to promote our archives and records, increase our visibility, as well as receive feedback, both negative and positive. Facebook has undoubtedly allowed us to reach out to new audiences. A bit of an unashamed plug. If you're not already a follower of PRONI's Facebook pages, can I encourage you to do so? There are some PRONI postcards which I personally put on each of your seats. They provide so when this is finished, I don't want to see any of those postcards. So please sign up. It is important, however, that the archives of the future are ready to exploit social media and whatever other new social media opportunities emerge, as undoubtedly they will. I'd like to say a few words about the importance of strategic leadership for the future of archives. The Dean this morning spoke of the importance of emerging leaders and referenced Peter as one. So the archive of the future, including PRONI, needs to be well led, clear about their purpose and way forward with a focus on delivery, whether this be in terms of receiving, preserving or making archives accessible. The importance of strategic leadership for the success of archives is not new. I mentioned the important leadership role of previous PRONI deputy keepers of the records, and I'm going to read you a quote which comes from a letter from David Chart written on the 21st of January 1925. This will be the first time I suspect this has ever been uttered in public, and the quote is, "A record office, more than any other department, is what it is made by its chief." As I read it, I thought, no pressure there, Michael. As director of PRONI, providing effective and strategic leadership is an ongoing challenge. Providing leadership can range from championing the role of archives at events such as today, through to advocating for archives with senior departmental colleagues to secure increasingly scarce public resources. All of us in the archival and record-keeping sector, not just directors, need to be persuasive archival leaders, advocates and ambassadors. As leaders, we need to persuade, influence and convince, quote, important others, that archives and records are worth resourcing properly. This, of course, is not easy, particularly in this age of austerity. Providing effective strategic leadership is a challenge, but ignoring this challenge is not an option. A few words in conclusion. I know that I am presumably preaching to the converted, that we're all agreed that archives are important and that this importance will continue into the future. As the speakers today have hopefully demonstrated, there are many future challenges for archives, just as there are many future opportunities. The Beyond 2023 project is a good example of an opportunity for the archive of the future, in that it draws on the past whilst looking to the future to deliver a virtual recreation of the 1923 Public Record Office. I don't underestimate the challenges ahead, but high-profile projects such as this are unique opportunities to demonstrate how archives, history, and technology can combine to deliver new and innovative resources. As Director of PRONI and Deputy Keeper of the Records, I'm determined that PRONI will do its part to work in partnership and collaboration with Trinity College Dublin, the National Archives in Kew, and the National Archives here in Dublin to make this project a success. As has been mentioned previously, I think that this is the first formal collaboration between our three archives, which hopefully will be a blueprint and template for future partnership working. As I've mentioned, we owe much to our archival predecessors, and so it is fitting that PRONI can contribute to this new 2022 venture. Finally, thank you for listening so attentively today, and I would like to invite you to visit PRONI either in person or online via our website or Facebook page. You will be most welcome. Thank you.
Hello. Good. Okay. First of all, I want to say that I think this is an absolutely fantastic and exciting project. It's so interdisciplinary, brings in so many different kinds of things that I find it really exciting. Archives, digital records, historians, virtual reality, architectural reconstruction, and my favorite bit, which I don't know that you intended this, but my old discipline of performance studies, which I used to do before I did this. The study of how people move in space, how they interact with objects. I think there's something in that. So I'm really excited to be here. I didn't read any Derrida before I came here. Chris has left. Oh, this is for him. There are traces of Walter Benjamin and Michel de Certeau in here, but I do not quote them directly, and you won't even know where they are. So this is the thing about being a person who's had a rather eclectic past in academia. I think I was asked to be on this panel to bring in a slightly outsider view. I don't mean the colonial accent part, but the fact that the Digital Repository of Ireland is not directly involved in this project, although I may say that maybe we're not yet directly involved in this project, because I would love to be, because I think it's very exciting. But also I think to bring in the perspective of digital preservation. So we're talking about archival preservation, we're talking about the loss of these material records and what we can do to digitally reconstruct them, but the perspective that I can bring in here today is around this concept of digital preservation. So I want to thank Peter and Shay and Kieran Wallace as well for inviting me to hash it out with the keepers, or the deputy keepers, of our public records, and all of you today. I won't say too much because this is a public forum, so it'll turn to you, I think, shortly after I sit down. So as Helen said, I'm director of the Digital Repository of Ireland. We are headquartered at the Royal Irish Academy, but we are a partner organization, so we're composed of staff at the Academy, but also here at Trinity College Dublin and Maynooth University, and we had other partners that built the project in the beginning as well across Ireland. So what are we? We are a trusted digital repository. And the focus of what we do is on the long-term preservation of digital objects. Our remit is humanities and social sciences for the academics in the room, or cultural and social data, same thing said differently, for Ireland. So our function is to take care of these digital objects in much the way that physical archives take care of material objects for the long term. And we primarily take care of objects that are from other institutions. So we're not, we don't own or claim copyright to those materials, but instead we provide stewardship. And we have partnered with most of the cultural institutions in Ireland, a lot of the higher education institutions, some government agencies. So as both of our previous speakers were saying, collaboration in this world, in this new kind of, not new anymore, but still constantly changing digital world is very key. So material objects can be quite fragile, as the example of the day points out to us, but digital objects are much the same. They're equally, I would say, if not more fragile than a physical object. And in order to make sure that they last over time, they need to be carefully cared for. They need to be monitored, subject to safety precautions, etc. If a material object is partly destroyed, you may be able to salvage part of it. So think of a book that is burned, and think of those inside pages. You might be able to carefully peel open and look past the charred edges to see some of what is inside. It might be possible to read it, even if the integrity of the whole is gone. But if you take away just a random part of a digital object, if it degrades just a little bit, then the internal structure of that changes and it can disappear and not be accessible at all. That corruption can have a different kind of effect. So this all sounds very scary, but in the same way that archives now have temperature and humidity controls, and I assume lots of sprinklers, sprinkler systems, digital preservation can also put controls into place. So digital preservation, I would say, is a truly interdisciplinary adventure, and what we see happening in the Beyond 22 project points to that. We have software engineers at the DRI, archivists, researchers in the humanities and social sciences, policy specialists, project managers, historians, education and outreach, and so on and so on. And that's not just because we're really excited and want to try all parts of things. It's because all of those aspects are required in order to move this kind of digital agenda forward. So as I was saying, what we do at the DRI is we preserve digital objects. And in order to move this really amazing project of Beyond 22 forward, at least at this stage of funding, what they have done is they have harnessed this network of digital objects that are being taken care of by other institutions, and they've created this amazing network of discovery and access. So to come back to the concept of digital preservation, it's not just about keeping stuff safe. The point of preserving things is not just to keep it safe, but to provide access to it so people can find it, so they can see it, so they can use it, and in this case, certainly so they can enjoy themselves in the process, because it's a really fun project. To me, access is really key, because when it comes down to it, why bother saving things if nobody's ever going to look at them? Right? We can't always know what people want to see in advance. We can't always predict the future, so we have to make careful decisions around that, and save things so that they can be accessible as time passes. I'm really, really delighted to hear that Beyond 22 will be open access. This was mentioned earlier today. And I think this is really key. We are in a world of open access right now. Open data, open science, the European Open Science Cloud, fair data, which is about making data findable, accessible. These are some of the terms that are being thrown around in the research world, around research data. But the line between what's research data and what's part of a public collection that can be used for research, that's kind of blurring. So I think openness is quite key. Access is a complicated beast. It's not the most simple thing to provide. As Jeff said, there are massive efforts going into trying to make records available. Digitization is just one step. So you can digitize something, but you still have to put it somewhere and make it findable for people to be able to do anything with it. They need to be available. They have to be in formats that are compatible so they can be used on different platforms. Ideally linked in some way to other relevant records so you can discover them or find them and know that they exist in the first place. So I think the idea with digital preservation is if we can do this right now, if we can build into our processes the effort to make things accessible digitally, then constructing time-based archives or archives of things that are located in disparate places won't quite have to operate at the level of Interpol, if that still exists. Sounds very exciting when I say it, but which this project has done, right? You have to go out and find where all these pieces are and bring them together. Wonderful venture. And it's a project that's required immense coordination. We can see that's gone into it. But it does beg us to ask, now that we're operating in a digital age, when many, if not all of the documents that we're looking at stating for the future are born digital, they start that way now. How do we plan for the size and the scope of this? And I'm sure everyone in the archive sector and the libraries, et cetera, in this room are addressing this constantly, this question. And it is being addressed. Things are being done, which is the good thing to know. National archives or national records offices have fairly clear remits and certainly very real constraints on their collections in terms of scope and size. But what this project does, by accessing records that are being individually stewarded by different organizations, is to kind of reshape this idea of one location as the central organizing metaphor for collecting. Now it's about coming from different places and being brought together into one virtual location. Or does it do that? Because at the same time, location is the organizing conceit for Beyond 2022, right? You are placing things back in this virtually reconstructed building. Then the user can go into that building, they can look at the shelves, they can see things on the shelf. I did the virtual reality thing with the goofy goggles earlier. It's super exciting and scary if there's other people around you that you can't see. But this concept of space is very appealing and interesting to me in terms of what this project is doing. I'm intrigued by the relationship between the document and the presentation of that document in this project, to be locating it back on a shelf. Before the fire of 1922, these records were physical objects, right? In physical boxes on shelves in a building. They were contained in this one place. So what does this kind of reconfiguration of finding them, these copies elsewhere, returning them to the same place, which is actually a virtual space, but then trying to reconstruct the physical experience through that virtual space? What does this do to our interest of accessing objects? How does this shape that experience or our ability to discover them? Because in the end, I think the innovation is about the way that we access this information, right? The copies are available elsewhere, you've told us. It's not making up copies that aren't there. So people can go around to archives to find these. But this project is exciting for how I think it elides those constraints of time and space and brings things together. We're in the middle, I would say, of a digital revolution in the GLAM sector, the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums sector. Research has shown that GLAMs have digitized their collections and have put a lot of them online, and actual audience attendance numbers have gone up. So you don't have to go to the place to see the thing in all cases anymore, but people want to go, okay? And so why is this? Is it because viewers didn't know something existed in a particular archive before they saw it online? Is it because the digital version is somehow inadequate, or is it because the aura of the original still persists? We want to get our hands on it. We want to see the real thing in the crinkly paper. That we fetishize the object, for example? Or is it that, is the digital object a particular mode of discovery, and curiosity dictates that audiences may want to try different kinds of discovery? They may want to try it in VR. They may want to try something like the IIIF viewer, which allows you to zoom in. The UCD Library and ourselves are doing an event on that next month if you want to hear more about that. So what is it that shapes this experience? Just this morning, as I was finishing off my remarks, I got an update from the Archives and Records Association of the UK and Ireland about the proposed release of a new archives card that would allow for the identification of patrons and access to participating archives across the UK and Ireland. So the idea is you sign up for one plastic card and you can access a host of different archives in this area with that. This is one method of promoting kind of access across things. So researchers have been creating their own virtual collections by going around to different archives forever, right? They have to go to the places to find them. So something like this archives card recognizes this and makes it easier. And I think Beyond 22 really harnesses this power as well. It makes it easier by pulling the contents metadata into one site, but it's really fascinating to me how it uses the building as a way to enhance that discovery and that access. Or maybe it's that they're reinserting the trusted librarian and archivist in the shape of of an avatar dressed in some kind of medieval clothing back into the frame and making sure that we can still interact in some kind of way. I'm not saying it's the same as talking to a real archivist or librarian, and we want that experience as well. Anyway, I that's the end of my remarks. I was asked to address the digital futures in this moment. I don't know if I did that because sometimes I'm not sure how different the digital future is from the contemporary material future, other than things are definitely growing very quickly and changing as quickly or more rapidly. But we'll leave it to the forum to discuss that. So thanks.
So thank you to all our speakers. I picked up one reference, Natalie. I think you referenced.
This could be a fun game.
Yeah. So I picked up locks because you talked about keeping stuff safe. And one of the digital preservation strategies that came out of Stanford was lots of copies keep stuff safe. Locks. And in some ways, think about it, that is how all of this material has survived, because there are transcripts in California or in London or whatever. And so I think digital preservation is extremely important. And can you imagine the irony if in 50 years' time, James, having done all this work to virtually recreate something that was destroyed 100 years ago, if you're not the poster child for digital preservation and that all of your outputs aren't preserved. Just a point. I think that's my one thing. So just to pick up that comment of Chris's about power, I'm personally a huge fan of the soft power of cultural diplomacy and the soft power of virtual recreations and virtual reconstructions. So one of the things I've been involved with was the virtual recreation of the Codex Sinaiticus, the earliest New Testament in the world. And it was written in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. And then it was like a picaresque story. Baron von Tischendorf borrowed it in the 19th century. And so it goes from St. Catherine's, and then it goes to Leipzig. And then it goes to St. Petersburg. And then the communists sell it to the British. So the earliest copy of the New Testament in the world, 43 leaves are in Leipzig, 5 fragments are in St. Petersburg, 350 odd leaves are in London, and then in the 70s, in between the Justinian walls of the St. Catherine's Monastery, they find more leaves. And there's it's a restitution issue. And so at about this time in the project, I can remember there was a group, and it was like the United Nations, we should do this, bring it all together, digitize it, virtually recreate it. And that's what we did. And then the first day, the day when it all went live, some of you have heard me say this, I was one of 3 people alive who had seen this in all 4 locations. The day that we recreated it and put it online, over 24 hours, 20 million people looked at the Codex Sinaiticus. And that the power of virtual recreations is huge. And so I'm personally a huge fan. And on that note, I'd like to invite Professor Lorna Hughes to kick off with some comments. So Lorna, we just discovered again, we work together, is professor at Glasgow, not now digital humanities, but information studies, which is very interesting. So Lorna, would you perhaps like to have some thoughts on?
Sure. Thanks very much.
Yes.
Stand up, yes. So thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much, everybody, for such thoughtful thought-provoking presentations, and I just wanted to sort of kick off the discussion with a few comments and thoughts about the digital component that underpins this, and the digital component that underpins informatics at this particular time. And as Helen said, I am a professor of digital humanities, and I work in information studies at Glasgow University, which used to be the Humanities, Advanced Technology and Information Institute. It was a digital humanities centre. It's now a Department of Information Studies. And we had great fun yesterday when I informed Shay and Peter that my affiliation had changed, and could they update the website tonight before the lunch? We'll gloss over that. But I think it is important, because I think this reflects a shift in the digital humanities towards away from the concept of siloization of digital humanities as something that happens in a centre over there, as a guiding critical framework for understanding information, and information very broadly defined: museums, archives, libraries, heritage, culture, very, very broadly defined. And understanding digital approaches, as we've seen here, the sort of virtual reconstruction of the past, conceptualizes that framework and helps us understand that recreating these source materials in a digital way is an opportunity to look back and reconstruct an archive as it stood on a moment in time, but also to look forward and think about our understanding of digital infrastructures, of the representation of archives, of our relationship with history, our relationship with space, which changes when represented digitally. There's so much in this project, and there's been so much in the presentations here that it's difficult to know where to start with a debate or a discussion. But I think for me, where this all kicks off is the new research questions that we can now start to think about. And with a framework like this, as presented by the speakers here, those research questions are not just historical or archival, they're conceptual. They deal with movements, people, movements of archives, movements of place. Research questions that we couldn't actually think of without seeing this in virtual format and in digital format. And I think that's something where we can see the archival and the historical and the cultural questions coming together so well. So I think that the next phase of this project, it's about infrastructure, it's about digital collections, it's about interfacing with the past and new approaches to history, and of course it's about preservation of the past, but bringing all these together as strands to kind of kick off the debate. I thought that the project is such a good example and such a good articulation of what can be done that it's all up for debate now. So thanks.
Thank you. I should have said, of course, that Professor Hughes is the chair of the advisory group to the project. So thank you very much for those remarks. I'm going to open it up now. I would particularly welcome, perhaps in the first instance, some thoughts about the international dimension, maybe the political dimension, dare I say the Brexit dimension.
Let's go there.
Yes, let's go there. So or anything that anyone wants to raise, please. Right at the back, please. Could you, Michal, would you introduce yourself, please?
Michal Shukru, I'm the head of history here at Trinity College. And first of all, just to warmly congratulate Peter and Shay and the whole team. It's a really remarkable project, and they deserve a huge amount. Our huge congratulations for what they've achieved so far, and all the partners who are involved as well. One of the things that's really struck me is somebody who's been involved in digital humanities projects for the last 10 years. I always, myself, and this is perhaps my conservatism, still like to see a hard copy at the end of it all. And I think an awful lot of history, colleagues in history, for all their engagement with the digital, still have something about a hard physical copy that means so much. And in talking about preservation, one thing that really struck me is that the digital environment still seems so fragile. Now, when we talk about long-term preservation, everybody recognizes the importance of long-term preservation, But the actual sort of solutions that are presented at the moment are still, in my view, very woolly and really unsatisfactory in terms of making sure that the catastrophic loss we suffered in 1922, that it doesn't happen again in some shape or form with a digital archives or the digital archives that we're creating. So without looking for definitive answers, because I don't think there are any at the moment, I'd just be curious to know of our colleagues at the head table there, where do they see this particular conversation going? Because, as I said, whenever we look for answers on this, there never seems to be an answer as such. There's a lot of recognition, acknowledgement, sympathy and empathy around it, but very little sort of hard information or, genuine reassurances that can be given. So I'm just wondering what their view is in terms of this challenge of long-term preservation of the digital archives to prevent catastrophic loss like we've suffered here, as I say, almost 100 years ago.
Thank you, Michal. So I was one of the founding directors of the Digital Preservation Coalition in the UK, and I can remember that the National Archives were probably ahead of everyone. Jeff, would you like to make any comments?
Hello. That's a really good point, and I think so. Where are we at? So we have a working digital archive. The issue for us is about scale. So the sheer volume of digital information, in particular born digital information that the UK government holds, is quite mind-boggling. And we're at the cusp of taking in large transfers of born digital information. We know we can preserve different file formats. We know that the system works. We know that we have a fairly robust infrastructure to be able to keep copies and make sure that we can constantly iterate to provide that long-term preservation solution. But I mentioned our digital director in my speech. John Sheridan is one of those people with a brain the size of a planet, and he always says digital preservation is really hard. I think, wow, that is really clever when you say that. And that's true. And I think we are getting there, but it is really hard. We describe ourselves as a first generation digital archive, and what we mean by that is we are effectively replicating in digital physical processes. And we know that's okay for now, but it's not going to cut it in the long term. So the challenge for us is how do we move to be a second generation digital archive whilst at the same time be able to handle the kind of volumes of information that we know we're going to be taking in the next few years. So I agree, and it's hard. It's my
I could say from an Northern Ireland perspective, civil service departments in Northern Ireland within, I think, 6 to 8 years, the transfer of all records will be digital. Paper copy records will be gone. This is a challenge which the civil service is facing up to, and many of the issues that Jeff has alluded to still to be dealt with. I suspect one of the issues is that I think a lot of people think that it won't happen, but obviously it is going to happen. So that's a real challenge. Within PRONI, we've developed a digital repository, and to go back to an issue which I referenced in my talk, one of the challenges again for us is securing the funding within government to properly populate that repository. So we have developed it, but we don't have the resources to further develop it. So there are challenges there. And I think Michal has raised a very interesting question, which is one that I haven't given an awful lot of thought to. But that obviously, if we had the fire in 1922, it behoves us to make sure that if we preserve records digitally, that there isn't some sort of a trap door down the line that could negate our effort.
I'll jump in there too. I do think it is a challenge, certainly, but I think that we have a lot of potential answers to those challenges. So to me, the challenge lies in the scale at which we are creating and therefore have the need to preserve new digital records. And partly in the way that we approach preservation. So we have the answers, and we're quite good at being able to preserve records of different file types. When it comes to something more complex like a digital humanities project, there are ways to approach that as well, but I don't think the solutions that are being implemented are yet satisfactory. In the end, I actually think resourcing is the biggest issue of it all. It's not the technological challenge of being able to do it, and being able to do it in a very robust, convincing, and secure way. We can do that. But, preparing records so that they can not just be put into storage to be preserved, but again, to be accessed, which I was speaking to before, takes a lot of time. But it's a challenge that, I would say many archives and libraries have lots of boxes of things they haven't cataloged yet as well, right? So it's not an entirely new challenge. But the scale and the velocity, I think, are part of the challenges there.
Does anyone else want to come in on that issue? I was thinking that oftentimes it's not the technology, it's the organisational issues, as you were saying, Natalie. But what's this about digital preservation and storing data on DNA? Have I picked that up right? No? Oh, God. Is that someone who's coming back? No, it's someone stretching. So, thank you for that. Shall we go into a different direction? Who wants to take us? I'd still love to do the politics. Please. Can you have the microphone at the front, please?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can I ask a very crude and ancient question? When I was growing up, we had a fear of nuclear war. And the big thing from a digital point of view was the electromagnetic pulse that was going to absolutely obliterate everything that was kept in any sort of magnetic form. And I think when one of the Russian planes was shot down and found to have a valve radio, there were two interpretations of that. One was that they're way behind us, and the other one was that they're way ahead of us. These sort of, the physical environment for stuff that is being stored magnetically. Are people looking at these things, and how deep is the sort of physical security involved in these, quite apart from stuff not getting corrupted in the ordinary way? Thanks.
Does anyone want to respond?
I think that raises quite a few issues. Not least I remember those videos. I was always skeptical that if you braced yourself in a doorway, you survived. Or under the table. I think it goes to the heart of what it means to be an archive when it comes to digital information. So we've just moved our web archive onto the cloud. I'm kind of reasonably relaxed about that. A few years ago, I probably wouldn't have been. There's something about, as the keeper, there's something about ownership, and while we were building our digital records infrastructure, I felt comforted by the fact that I could see it and touch it and feel it, and it was in my building, and it was in my control. But I think the reality of digital preservation in the future is probably going to be one about access and permissions, and it's probably not going to be about the physical storage of digital content on a tape or on a server. I mean, obviously the cloud at the end of the day has that infrastructure behind it, but I think it becomes more virtual in nature. And actually then the question is, at what point do you flick the permission switch? At what point does all of this information that existed over here cease to be current and become historical, and the responsibility transfer from the department to the National Archive, and equally the burden that goes with it. I mean, we have to be frank, at that point things like FOI transfer as well. So, and again it goes back to resources then. So it's a very valid comment, and I suspect the answer is that we have to just think in a very different way about what the long-term future is going to be of digitally created information, and who owns it, and who controls it, and where it exists, and perhaps some of the more traditional ideas of servers and tape stores and rooms are perhaps not going to be the challenge in the future.
Perhaps one of the potential strengths and solutions of this particular project is because there are several partners. So if I compare it, the Trinity College Dublin, we're a legal deposit library for the UK. And so we work with the British Library, Oxford, Cambridge, National Library of Wales and National Library of Scotland on electronic legal deposit. So we now have 10 million websites, we have hundreds of thousands of e-journals and e-books, and those are in the 6 different places. So there's 4 hubs in the national libraries, 2 in the British Library, North and South, National Library of Wales, National Library of Scotland, and then there are mirror sites at the 3 universities. So we are a mirror site. So should something happen to your question here, for example, then there are 5 other sites that hold that material. Maybe that's going to be one of the potentials of this project. Shay, do you want to?
Yeah, well, there is a whole field of research in the area of disaster recovery and data preservation with regards to that. But as Jeff alluded to, I guess the real strength of secure cloud-based storage is that your data is replicated and it's geographically dispersed. So if your data is stored on the cloud, it's likely on a server somewhere here in West Dublin and also in California, for example, on separate storage centers. And if we're, I guess, dealing with a catastrophe that affects both of those places, then access to that data is going to be the least of our worries at that point. But that would be the most straightforward answer, would be that the data is replicated in numerous geographical locations, so you're hoping that in the event of disaster in one place, it can be immediately replicated and recovered.
Thank you. John?
Thanks, Helen. Sorry, John McDonough, National Archives. I suppose I'm just kind of carrying that idea through for the archive for the future. And I'm listening to my colleagues at the top table. I guess what I'm kind of thinking about is some sort of blended approach as we go forward, in that I think the archive of the future would be about trust and will be possibly around us as the honest broker. So we may not be taking all of these records in from loads of different places and trying to manage 2,000 different file formats and X terabytes of data, but we will trust other repositories to hold it, and we'll possibly be like Amazon for food about 2022, or something like that. It will be a brokerage system whereby if we're directing somebody to a particular set of records, it's got our imprimatur. So I think that the paper model of the physical accession, the physical management, and and having to be masters of everything, I think is unsustainable as a resource issue. And I think the biggest challenge we have is to move preservation of the food stream, or of the food chain. So people think about preservation at the time of creation, rather than seeing preservation as an afterthought. So we're putting all of our efforts and all of our thing into ubiquity of mobility, of accessibility, and we're going with sort of preservation of later. And then we end up with that particular services. We're only not our time for Twitter goes. Sorry. But it's going to be like the next Twitter or the next MySpace, and all of the resources that we put into holding that platform and delivering on that platform is sitting in front of us.
Thank you. We got 2.
Can I just ask about the issue of the more traditional archival skills of preparing lists, making inventories in this digital age? Because I think so far we've been discussing about the preservation of the actual objects, but as archivists we know that yes, indeed, that's basic. But at the same time, we also know that in order to facilitate access, we need to have our staff working on preparing finding aids to those materials. So just any reflections on that kind of traditional skill within this new digital era?
So I think that's a really good point. The truth is that I think on a lot of digital information, those traditional skills are not relevant. It doesn't mean they're not relevant in the wider context, but if you think, I will go into a government department who will be sitting on untypically 80 terabytes of email, and there's no way in any reality that you're going to be able to describe that content in a typical way. That it's just too big. It's too unstructured. Tim Collins would tell me off for saying unstructured, but let's go with that because I can't think of a better word. It's too unstructured. There's too much of it, and it's just too difficult to make sense of it. It doesn't fit the typical taxonomy that you would use in any traditional archiving practice. Having said that, though, I am pleased that you kind of brought back the conversation a little bit. We're sort of halfway between the physical and the digital. I quite often find that these things are posed in a kind of false dichotomy. The reality for archives of the future is that we will continue to inspire people with our content, and we will continue to engage people with our content, and some of that we will do in a real sense, and some of it we'll do in a virtual sense, and that's fine. But it's not a binary choice. Pardon, it isn't one or the other. And I think one of the other phrases that we've tended to use is that archives have to be used to be useful, and I think that's a very helpful reminder to us that we have to work hard to engage audiences. We have to, in some respects, this power thing is a really interesting point. Is that I'm really uncomfortable with the notion of that. I think actually our job is to get out of the way. I think our job is to allow people to engage with our content in ways that they choose, to do things that they want to do. And you can imagine that in a digital world, because if you've got data sets and you're exposing those data sets, who knows what people are going to do with them? And we don't need to facilitate that. We don't need to get into that space. And in the same way, we have to break free from some of the traditional constructs of an archive and allow people to engage with our content physically and digitally in ways that they choose, not in ways that we prescribe. So I know the power is probably used in a different way, but it makes me uncomfortable in some respects to hold on to some kind of notion that we're gatekeepers, because I don't think we should be. Debate.
From a PRONI perspective, I think to me again it goes back a lot to an issue of resourcing. And PRONI would have small teams that would still be involved in traditional archiving practices. We've got something like 3 million. What I was saying there was that PRONI has something like 3 million records. We have limited staff resources. We attempt to get through this in an organised way, whilst at the same time attempting to address the challenge that's being posed because of populating the digital repository and preparing for the receipt of departmental records virtually within 6 years. The fundamental issue, and it's been said, is in my view, is resourcing. And there was mention of political will of small p. It again goes back to the point that I made in my talk about directors, archivists providing strategic leadership. And one of my roles, and I'm sure it's the same with Jeff, is to make the argument about the importance of providing effective resourcing to allow archives to be maintained properly. As I said, it's easy to say, difficult to do. There are other priorities, health, education, and so on. So you're in a congested space arguing your case.
I'm trying to think through how to respond to that question, because I think the traditional capabilities of information management and understanding the way to deal with structure are still relevant, but maybe not perhaps in quite the same configuration as the traditional skills taught in archiving schools. So I think there needs to be a shift in education towards looking at things from a digital perspective. I mean, I've heard this from the National Archives a couple of times. We can't keep approaching things from the same way we're dealing with a whole new digital era, and John Sheridan talks about having to shift that. which I do think is the case in some ways, but I'm not sure it's as revolutionary as it's always discussed to be. Yeah, I don't really know how to end this point other than there are new skills that are coming into play that have to be adapted and shifted towards, but I think that some of the existing ones are still quite relevant. But dealing with things at scale does mean finding other kinds of technical ways to get into that information. So.
Okay, there was one. This will be the final question, please.
As an amateur genealogist, I'm just making reference with you in a few references to under the freedom of information. So with the new data regulations coming in force in May of this year, which are European, how does this private information come under this? As my understanding of information is that once a person is deceased, their information is can be in the public domain. So how is all the new regulations that are going to come into force? It's going to be collaborations across the EU.
So my understanding is there's an archival exemption, and I'm going to look at the director of the Archives of Ireland, my friend John, to respond further.
Thank you. Well, there's specific derogations for archiving in public interest, and I think we'd be looking at those to use for genealogical and other information.
Thank you. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd particularly like to thank our panel before handing back over to Peter. So thank you very much indeed.
So yeah, just very briefly to wrap up, a few thanks. So thanks very much to our panel, to Natalie, to Michael, to Jeff, and to Helen for moderating so well. So it's been, I think you'll all agree, a fascinating discussion. So thanks very much, guys, to you all. I want to also thank our other archival partners, so John McDonough from the National Archives and John McCaffrey from the Irish Manuscripts Commission, who were part of this discussion this morning. I want to thank Jane again. I want to thank both Jane's hats. So as the IRC chair, who are our funding body here, who have graciously funded this project and allowed us to do the wonderful research we've been able to do so far and provide this teaser towards what's possible, and as director of the Hub for hosting us here today in the wonderful building. I also want to thank the Hub staff, so Francesca, Emily, Eve, Sarah. Everyone has been, great at helping us run today as smoothly as it has, and we wouldn't have been able to do so without your guys' help. So thanks so much for that. And finally, I know Peter already thanked our team earlier this morning, but just to reiterate that, so Mark Farrell from Computer Science and Adapt, who's done all the work that I'm claiming credit for today. Indira, who has been manning our social media channel, our Twitter account today. Indira's here somewhere. But especially Kieran Wallace, who has basically organised everything that's happened here today. So thanks so much to all the team, and thank everyone for attending. So thank you all.